So today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to discuss the shadow side of the seven planets, which includes Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. And we're going to talk about when they're malfunctioning and the darker side of these planets come out. How do they manifest? But before getting on to the video, if you guys want more info on my courses, readings, and the articles that I upload, go to parisayazdi.com and you'll find it all there. Hi, Jay.
Hello. Interesting topic.
Yeah, it is an interesting topic because normally these planets, all the seven traditional planets, they're kind of telling us how existence and the nature of existence being operationalized. But then we human beings come to interact with the world with our ego, with our minds, with our desires. And then there are certain social norms in society that make certain ways that we feel a taboo or unacceptable. So those aspects of ourselves that we need to express become our shadow points. And then these planets are saying something about which part of it is. It could be about the moon, which could become codependency. The sun can become egotistical. Mars can become violent. So these are the kinds of things I would like for us to maybe talk about today and kind of explore and see where it goes.
Sounds good.
Does when I say shadow, does that what do you take of the shadow? Because Jung specifically had very extensive work kind of articulating what the shadow side is, but I just want to know what's your take of the shadow side of the psychology or the person.
Well, it's kind of the inner, like the deeper part, maybe.
Yeah, the parts that are suppressed and repressed,
Yeah.
and then they come out in very strange ways. For example, maybe I should give a couple of examples just to clarify how what a shadow side is, how it could come out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so for example, you see someone who's super ambitious and they start to go towards that way of living, which we call a workaholic. And they're very competitive and they need to be the best and they need to reach the top. And they become very uncompromising to just keep reaching the higher part of the ladder to become successful. But all of this ambition could be have its driver within the shadow side of the self, which is actually coming from a feeling of inadequacy, that I'm not good enough. And then you go back to this person's narrative and in their life, and in the very back of it, there's a father or a parent who's constantly telling him, you're not good enough. You'll never be anything. So this kind of drive and mode that they developed is coming from a place of overcompensating for that sense of inadequacy. It's almost that the ego self, the self here, the sun, that sun aspect
Hmm.
needs to prove itself. And then when our shadow side is driving us forward in life, we become pretty destructive in relation to other people because we know like workaholics do not take care of their family life, their relationship, or even their own health because they're so just driven to just be somebody. I just need to be somebody. There's that feeling of inadequacy when you go deep within. So it's being driven by that shadow aspect of it. Okay, so let's start with the sun. The sun represents our consciousness, our sense of self, our identity. It represents a healthy kind of an ego. We need the ego. The ego has a bad rep. I've said this in a number of videos, in a sense that people just right away want to say the ego is a bad thing. The ego is a mechanism for us to deal with the external world, to make ourselves known to the world so that the world interacts with us in a particular way that we need it to. But, and the sun also represents leaders, authority figures, someone who's very decisive, stable, reliable, is all the great qualities that we look for in a human being. It also represents the truth. It illuminates the path. But when we have the shadow side of the sun operating here, we get narcissism, for example, and a lot of arrogance. So that sense of self-concept that a person would have from a healthy sense of self, from a having a very good, stable identity becomes a little bit shaky. That sense of autonomy, self-trust. All of these things are very weak in the individual. So they constantly need to project this persona that's just larger than life. Look at me. It's all about me. Give me the attention. I'm somebody. I'm the leader. These kinds of things are actually showing that the person's operating from the sun's, that shadow aspect of the sun, not that illuminating, life generating, life giving, that protective mechanism that's in the sun. They actually become life destroying in a lot of ways. You know, the sun has that mild malefic aspect to it,
Mhm.
burn things up. That's what narcissists do. That's what arrogant people do. There's just so much of themselves that they need to assert externally and externalize that they overpower people around them. And it's to their own detriment and detriment of others because it's the shadow operating. Yeah. It's just this blinding light of superiority. It's too much. And then with the sun, you can, because of that leadership authority figure, you can get a lot of domineering and controlling aspect of the person when the shadow side is operating. So the person can be very authoritative, dictatorial, directly controlling other people. But if the person actually doesn't have that, they can go in a covert way in the background where they'll start accusing other people of being domineering and controlling to kind of calm them down so that they can feel their own kind of power. So these power dynamics become very dominant when the sun is operating in a dysfunctional way in a chart or as a symbolism. And most of this generally comes from not having a good self-concept, not having a stable identity, not knowing who one is, what one's purpose in life is, what one is good at. There's a lot of insecurity and overcompensation. So the shadows of the sun is usually coming from a false sense of self, unstable kind of an identity. In a sense, when I say identity, in a way that the person's actually looking at external cues to identify itself and to make itself identifiable rather than having a self-concept where it knows who it is. So there's always this other persona at play instead of them being themselves in a situation. So there's a lot of overcompensation that's coming from a place of insecurity, not feeling powerless, not having authority. So it's coming from these kinds of places. It's generally low self-confidence when we look at the shadow side of the sun. Do you have anything to add to that before we move on to the moon?
No, I guess the sun's mostly about ego, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's just like
So,
egotistical, not just ego. It's like the ego
yeah.
is very big. Like when we watch movies and there's that overwhelming father who's like a dictator in the household and everyone feels like they can't breathe. That's not a healthy son. That's a son that's coming from a place. That individual, if you go inside of them, they actually feel powerless. They're actually dealing with a lot of fear that they're going to lose things and they're going to lose control and that their life is going to turn into a havoc. And if you go even deeper into their narrative, you'll see where it stems from, which is probably the way that they were brought up to always feel insecure about their situation, that they don't have a stable place in the world, that they are purposeless, they are senseless. These kinds of dynamics start to create these shadow sides in a person. Now, if we go to the moon, the sun is the masculine principle and it's that externalizing factor. The moon has to do with our interiority, is a receptive planet and is a feminine principle. So it has to do with our emotion, with our internal landscape, like our subjectivity, our desires, sense of care, nurturance, and these facets of the self is our internal self. And when you have the shadow sides of the moon, it creates a lot of emotional instability. So it's like moodiness. The person's up at this time and then they're down and then they have these very neurotic kind of outbursts of emotions. Just managing emotions, it's It's very unpredictable and it can be irrational almost. There's no attunement. The person's not in touch with themselves, so it's just constantly reacting. And then the moon's shadow side can also create dependency and attachment, like codependency. There's that feeling that one's inner self is not enough. There's a sense that it's not full enough. So it's always relying on other people to fulfill these lacks and gaps within themselves. So there's a sense of emotional insecurity within the person. There's the paradigm of scarcity. I don't have enough. I need other people to nurture me. And this becomes like a handicap in life when a person has this inner self that they can't be self-reliant and they can't meet their own emotional needs and they always need an external crutch to do this. And codependent people can become manipulative in a sense of creating situations where other people have to cater to them. So the shadow side starts to guilt trip, for example. The shadow side will make the person act like they're sick all the time, like they have some terminal illness where other people need to take care of them. It can go that far with when we're talking about the shadow side of the moon. And then it has a lot to do with repression of emotions. So they can't handle emotional truth. If they're acting in a certain way and they're having an emotional outburst, and if someone brings it to their attention, like this thing that you're doing, it's not good for you and is not good for other people, they will have a lashback right away. They can't take the fact that what they're doing is actually harmful to themselves and their surrounding. So they can become overly passive or overly aggressive in an emotional way to retaliate or to withdraw. So these are all the shadow sides of the moon, as in terms of the mind or internal landscape when the moon is not functional. But when the moon is functional, it has this reciprocity, it has this care, it has this grace. It's a very graceful planet in that way. Like it's willing to listen to other people's emotion. It understands its own. It understands the changes in a very fluid way. It has a sense of adaptability. But when the moon is dysfunctional, it just becomes fixated on an emotion, on an internal state. And it's very hard for it to let go. And it starts to project these things externally to regulate its own internal sense of self. And this is and you know what, with all of these planets, when I talk about the shadow side of it, it could be placed in a chart, for example, in a way that is showing that the person's going to grapple with a lot of this throughout their lifetime. But all of us human beings will have certain life circumstances where these shadow sides come out, and there's no one who doesn't have a shadow side because from childhood, we didn't have all of our needs met. We didn't get to express ourselves fully and wholly the way that we needed to. There was always something that said repress it, restrict it. No, you're not. No, you can't. So all of these things become the shadows in the background, right? And then certain life circumstances uh, really makes us project them outward and makes it like awakens it, even if it's kind of asleep for a while because the life circumstances weren't tapping into it. So it's important for all of us to realize this. It's not like some people have it, some people don't, but people can have these into different degrees and then they're functional sometimes more so with some people and less so with other people.
To have it with every planet.
Yeah, we will, right? I mean, like with the sun, for example, I can walk into a place and feel very confident about the way I am in that space, my relationship with other people, what I'm able to do, how I can contribute, and maybe how I can even act as a leader. And then with the same sun, in another life circumstance down the road, I find myself in a place where I feel like, why am I even here? I might start getting imposter syndrome, like I'm not confident. I don't know how to deal with these people. I don't know what they want from me. I don't know what my purpose here is. It happens to all of us, right? And then a person who's worked on their shadow side, they will be able to say that to themselves. They'll be like, oh my God, I totally feel like an imposter. I have no idea why I'm here. And because they can acknowledge that right away, they can be like, okay, what can I do? What do I need to learn? How do I need to ask questions? How do I need to understand that I'm a student and be humble in this situation? But if a person's operating from their shadow side because they can't admit this to themselves, they'll start to act arrogant, pompous, just all those ways that we just talked about the sun, just putting on a persona, fake it till you make it kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that feeling is there, but the shadow of it is like, how do we come to deal with it? And then sometimes we're just stuck in certain situation where we feel too vulnerable, and then those other weird aspects start to come out instead of dealing with it in a way that's productive for our lives and for other people's lives. So now let's move to Mercury. And Mercury has to do with our intellect, with our communication, our interpretations, our relationship. How do we establish relationship between things, whether if they're ideas or people? And when we have a good intellect, we have good mental categories, so we can establish the proper kind of connection between things. And then we can show, like in math, right? Like you have a formula, you have to show it step by step how you arrive to the answer that you answer to. A good Mercury can do that. When the intellect gets glitched out and that shadow aspect of Mercury comes out, Mercury comes to be a lot about bending the truth, trickery, and deceit. It becomes Mercury's game with his shadow side. So it manipulates words. It because it's trying to establish connection through controlling the variables rather than letting the variables have their natural outcome. There's an objective at the end of it for Mercury here, for the intellect. So it's kind of constantly skewing variables and results to lead it to the outcome that it wants. And I think we've all experienced manipulative people and how they do this. They are constantly distorting truth. They're constantly making strange connections and establishing relationship between things that inherently has biases towards what it is that they want. And it's usually at the expense of other people. So again, the shadow side becomes something harmful. And then another shadow side of Mercury is that they become too cerebral, dismissal of emotions. So they try to rationalize everything through the mind. They can become calculating, they can become cold, detached. They tend to prioritize cleverness and efficiency over substance, over things that actually maintain relationships. So you can have these kinds of qualities as the shadow side of Mercury come out too. Mercury tries to, like that, going back to that whole deceitfulness and trickery of Mercury. Mercury, when it's functional, it wants symmetry and balance. Deceit and trickery in itself is saying that there's asymmetry because there's a bias, there's an objective that's trying to be reached at the end of it. So these kinds of things are showing that Mercury is not functioning in a optimal manner. It's skewing things. And then to make an excuse for this, a lot of time that deception thing, that deceitful thing that they do, they try to be very cerebral about it in terms of justifying it. I'm just trying to be efficient. That's how the world is. You shouldn't care so much. It's still going back to that deceitfulness of Mercury. And then another shadow side of Mercury is mental overactivity. So you can get anxiety from it, overthinking, because Mercury represents our central nervous system too. Constant worry, constant repetition of a thought, rumination. These are all shadow sides of Mercury, which is essentially causing mental exhaustion. And this is a Mercury that doesn't want a solution. This is why it's a shadow part. There is something in it for it to have the problem. To resolve the problem is for Mercury to arrive at the next point, and is something that a person fears. So this is something that, and we all do mental rumination and we all get anxiety. And sometimes this is coming from the shadow aspect, which is the person doing this because they don't want to solve the problem yet. And this is something that a person should be aware of because that mental exhaustion that will come from it, it should be evaluated against what's on the other end. Is what's on the other hand really harder than this mental exhaustion that I'm experiencing? And often it's not. It's like, let me just gather enough strength. Let me go to that sun thing that I have, to that Mars thing that I have, overcome this, and it'll be okay rather than just keep short circuiting and looping around something. So these are all shadow sides of Mercury. So now we move to Venus, and Venus is about connection, is about love, it's about beauty, harmony, is about all the kinds of acts that's related to bring things together and to create a union. And the objective of a healthy Venus, that was so Persian, Venus. The healthy objective of a Venus is to create a beautiful union and connection. Like when we look at beautiful works of art, there is this proportion to it. It's not like the symmetry of Mercury where it's exactly the same thing on one side and another, but Venus is more like the golden ratio. It wants to establish that kind of a harmony between the different parts, so the composition as a whole can hold the entirety of all the parts together. But when there's a shadow side of Venus, it can't do this. So it relies on superficial and surface aspect of things and the vanity of things. And it starts to have an obsession with the parts rather than how the parts fit into the whole of the picture. Like to only get hyper focus on one's appearance and then not to pay attention to who or what one is internally, it's saying something about the shadow side of a person. And this kind of thing has great repercussion when one gets older, because what we socially deem as, for example, beautiful, by the time one is 70 or 80, at least there's a different kind of a beauty. That beauty that society values is no longer there. But if someone just invested all their life force, resources, energy, self-concept, all of it into like, how do I look externally just on this one part? There is a price to be paid for that later on in life, because one's sense of self, back to that sun thing, and Venus is never really that far from the sun. Same with Mercury. That sense of self will come to suffer later on in life. Another thing about Venus is about that love aspect of it has a lot to do with cooperation and being peaceful. Venus is also the feminine principle, and it's about receptivity. Both of the feminine planets, Moon and Venus, have needs for fulfillment. And when Venus feels like other people are not cooperating with it, or it can't join and create a union with another person, another kind of manipulation can come from Venus too. It creates over neediness, but in a sensual way rather than in the way that Moon creates codependency. It can, I'm trying to think of an example in a relationship where.
Like they want codependency?
No, Moon wants codependency. Here, Venus will manipulate to create union, you know, like they exploit emotions, for example, or they will use just sex appeal and charm and charisma to get validation, for example, or to create, they want to create that connection, but it's not with the whole of their being, and they don't necessarily want to connect to the whole of another person's being either.
Like a temptress. It's a frowned upon word for women who it's like an evil thing.
Did you say evil?
Kind of.
Well, I guess one could interpret it as evil from an outside perspective, but it's just kind of the person wants the affection, but they're not necessarily giving the affection. They want the cooperation, but they're not necessarily giving the cooperation. But they're creating these lures and hooks to get other people to cooperate and to harmonize with them, to love them. It's a way to control relationships again with that, but there's a superficial component to it. Whereas a true Venetian quality without the shadow side is able to make themselves vulnerable, to give of themselves, to create that connection and to create that union. But when there's a shadow side of it, there's a lot of manipulation in relationships in order to feel connected or to establish a union. The shadow side of Venus can also over-idealize love, like the Cinderella story. Overly romanticized view of relationship, which is actually saying faulty expectation of the partner of how things ought to be in a relationship. We see that a lot. It's like you get into a relationship with like people haven't been, let's say, in a relationship for 2 years. And then when you ask them, well, how would you like your next relationship to be? They have a full picture of it, like what the person looks like, what they do in the morning, what they do on Valentine's Day, how they react in a fight. It's like we got to make some concession for a human being to be like a 3D human being with dimensions and not a caricature. There are some people who have this idea of what being in love, being in a relationship ought to be. And when they go in a relationship, they constantly project that. Like today, on such a day and a day, you should be doing this for me. This is how love is. If you don't do it, you don't love me. And the other person might not even had a thought of that ever in their head that that's what it means to love someone. So instead of making some room to actually maybe even to teach your partner, like, this is my love language, this is what makes me feel loved, they'll project all of these idealized way of being, which sabotages the relationship. It's just crazy expectations, which confuses people, a lot of people. So this is probably where it's good to also have a very healthy Mercury to be able to communicate, and then to have a healthy moon to be able to show the emotions. But yeah, Venus can do this, and out of fear of this, it avoids true intimacy and it refuses to have relationships. It will get into relationship with people that it knows that it will be sabotaged. It will not work out. So these are all shadow sides of planets that come out, such as Venus in this case. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Mars is the most masculine planet. Sun is too, but Mars is like the hyper masculine principle. And Mars is all about externalization, being inceptive, being igniting, initiating, moving forward. Mars has a straightforward trajectory from point A to B. So Mars represents our energy and our drive. And if Mars, this energy and drive is being repressed or suppressed, it doesn't have the right mechanism to check its initiative and its output, and it manifests as aggression, as hostility, as the desire to dominate other people. And it's usually through force, overpowering, conflict, destruction, overriding other people. And it just wants to demolish and plow through people. But Mars, when we look at a healthy Mars, Mars is a warrior. A warrior is a protector. A warrior knows why they're killing, who they're killing, what the objective is, and the objective is always to protect something. But the shadow side of the Mars that's been repressed, oppressed, and it doesn't know how to channel this, it's like a violent outburst that just burns everything around it, including itself. So this is a very devastating aspect of Mars, and Mars is one of the malefics. So the shadow side is not going to be benign. It's going to be very destructive. And another aspect of Mars is being impatient and reckless. It's like an engine that the fuel has been injected into it and it has to ignite. The combustion has already happened. So in itself, Mars is to ignite, to initiate now. So impatience is actually part of Mars in some ways because it's just ready to go. But that can turn into recklessness because Mars needed sense of direction from point A to B. Like, that's my destination, that's the target, that's the bullseye. So impulsivity becomes one of Mars's trademarks that impatience because of lack of direction becomes a sense of recklessness, which has great consequences for itself and other people. Yeah, it's just this aspect of Mars just brings self-harm and harm to other people. That haste without an objective, it doesn't know how to direct itself, so it becomes problematic. And another thing very noticeable with Mars is for example, there are certain human beings I've noticed that have a lot of internal inherent energy. And if they have to suppress that energy and that power that they inherently have, they do some really weird stuff, like taking downers like alcohol, heroin, smoking marijuana, escapism, things that repress and suppress their power and energy because they feel like they have to, because they've been told that they're too much, for example. There's just too much of you. You don't know where you're going, you don't know what you're doing. So they don't know how to direct themselves, and or there's a sense of guilt almost with having that kind of an energetic sense of self. They will repress it. They will self-medicate. These are shadow sides that can be related to Mars. They will take downers to be able to keep that energy and that life force and that power that they have repressed because there's no healthy outlet for it. And they were taught that there's nothing in this world that can accommodate the type of person that you are, which is essentially energetic. And from this, also from similar kind of a scenario, if the person is not able to repress it and to kind of trying to put out the flame and subdue it, and even when they do, there's always some kind of a cruelty from the shadow side that also comes out, which is actually the cruelty is desire for power, but the person can't, if they can't express it because they've told to subdue it, is cruelty in very overt kind of ways. It's like it can be overt too, because it can become ruthless and overwhelming and overpowering, overambitious, step over anyone. But then it can be from the background too, where they start to manipulate things when coming from that repressed aspect of the when Mars's powers are repressed. So these kinds of shadow sides can be related to Mars. Should I move on to Jupiter?
Yeah.
Okay. So Jupiter is a planet of positivity, and positivity in a sense of augmenting, adding. It's an additive planet. So it's about expansion. It also has to do with wisdom, knowledge, growth, beliefs, values, our philosophies in life. It's our guiding principle, Jupiter, in life. It's the way we learn bigger ideas and it's the way we teach bigger ideas. But Jupiter, that augmentive quality of it, the shadow side of it is excess. It's over expansion, is like negating that Saturn concept completely and just wanting more, do more. Everything's just in excess, too much eating, too much of everything. And this is very harmful. The balance is lost in a sense when there's a shadow side of Jupiter, and because there's a sense that nothing is ever enough. If you actually get deep inside to the person, there's a sense of being in a huge space and wanting to fill up the entire space, and then there's not enough stuff in the world to fill up the space, so the person's constantly chasing the ever more, the ever greater. It can create exhaustion in a person. It's overindulgence. It's wasteful when there's a shadow side of Jupiter. And there's just a sense of irresponsibility of how to manage one's resources. For example, massive credit card debt within a span of a week, all of your paycheck spent in matter of 2 days. This is just the too muchness that can come from Jupiter's shadow side, which is usually indicating internally the person's feeling that there's not enough.
Yeah.
That's the thing about shadow sides is whatever you project outwards, like with the sun's overconfidence. That overconfidence is actually showing there's not enough confidence. uh, Venus putting out that superficial beauty of everything's perfect on the outside. When you go inside the person, everything's fragmented, not harmonized, not in a state of union. Everything's fallen apart. There's an emptiness that's seeking fullness for the inner emptiness. That's what the shadow is trying to say. And then with Jupiter, because it represents our ethics and our moral, people who sit on a high horse and they criticize all social issues, all people, all these weird prejudices, one-sided, lump-sided arguments. It's overemphasis of their belief system, like this is the truth, this is the wisdom of the world, and like no other perspective can be taken into consideration. There's only one truth. Any alternating truth is just an insult to them. So it's just there's dogmatism and moral superiority when Jupiter has that shadow side to it and it's not functioning properly. And then another shadow side of Jupiter, because Jupiter does represent optimism, is over optimism and magical thinking, like depending so much on one's luck and not wanting to put in the actual effort to have some sense of realism again, which is Saturn, having external expectation that things just ought to happen because that's what I want, that's what I believe. All of these things have a lot to do with lack of self-trust. These kinds of magical thinking, that's the shadow side that is stemming from, that the person themselves cannot do the action that's required for good luck to intersect their action with the right timing and the right space and the right people. So they're just kind of like kicking back and keeping fingers crossed and hoping that everything will happen. And there's over optimism about these kinds of things, which usually actually ends up in failure. So because it's unrealistic. And now we're getting to our last planet, Saturn. Saturn's function is to limit and deduce. Like if Jupiter's positivity, Saturn's negativity, because it's trying to create restrictions, is preventing that Jupiterian thing to go excessively, infinitely big, where you get entropy out of it. Saturn's trying to still keep things within certain confines and limits and boundaries so that things actually make sense. And oddly enough, the shadow sides of Saturn are actually its prominent keywords or symbolisms, which is like fear and pessimism. And I think fear and pessimism can have a healthy point in everyday life, in a human life. We need fear because there are certain circumstances or dealing with certain human being where fear is informing us of the right kind of distance, of our limit, of our boundary, which is keeping us safe in the long run. But having the shadow side of Saturn, Saturn, for example, represents laziness. Fear can be a form of disengagement. You just, I don't want to deal with it. So it's just overwhelming fear, but it's fear of failure. So the person puts themselves in a lazy mode, not to do anything, because they actually don't want to face the obstacles, which also Saturn represents. So they experience a lot of stagnation, frustration. They deal with avoidance, lethargy, procrastination. These are all shadow sides that's coming from that fear of failing. And then they become pessimistic about things. A certain degree of pessimism is also important because we shouldn't just have that shadow side of Jupiter that believes anything. A little bit of pessimism in the sense of like, does it really work that way? What is the objective evidence here? Saturn, when it's healthy, it does this. But that fear that produces pessimism, why even try? It's going to fail anyway. Again, it's going back to the shadow side of Saturn, which is very fear oriented. And then Saturn, it's dry in its quality. There's a sense of stiffness and rigidity. And sometimes in life, that's a good thing because we just need to stand there. That's not the time to move forward yet. We just need to be there and take our stance, endure what it is, because that's the moment in life. But the shadow side of Saturn, when things are dysfunctional, that rigidity becomes about excessive control. So there's overemphasis on, like, people go on a trip and the person has an itinerary from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. You know, there's just an
Yeah.
overemphasis on structure and rules, and there's just this inflexibility, this authoritarian approach that's just completely overwhelming. Nothing can be spontaneous. And the shadow side of this is actually that rigidity is meant to control other people. And this is a very, very hard to deal with people who have this quality. I guess one of the last points we can touch on Saturn's shadow is self-limitation. And this usually comes from our upbringing a lot of times. It's we're not giving the proper wings to fly. It's like the person's wings have been clipped, and it just creates feeling of unworthiness. How do I say this? Like unworthiness, like I don't deserve things, self-pity. Um, it brings these kinds of feelings, guilt, shame. And the problem with these feelings are that we either present ourselves in the world as someone who's a victim and who's helpless. So, because we want the pity of other people, because that's the way we're getting that sense of attention and being affirmed in the world, or we end up projecting that to other people. And this is what a lot of parents who feel this do the same thing to their kids. And then it becomes like intergenerational problems to deal with. Their kids will carry those same shame and like they're not good enough, and that they're just limited as human beings. And there's almost this inner sense that if I try to break away from this, I will be punished. And all of these kinds of modes and ways of being are the things that lead to depression. Because how long can a person sit around and feel worthless and then feel guilt and shame about it and still feel like they can negotiate with any aspect of life? It makes you want to give up. It makes you want to tap out. So it's like when we talk about Saturn, if we look at Saturn significations, which 99.9% of them are all very difficult, when they're functional, they're telling us our limits and bounds so that we can grapple with different aspects of life and out survive it. But when the shadow aspects of Saturn comes out, it really becomes life denying. It's very hard to deal with excessive fear, with excessive feelings of self-control or control of others, and then having these self-limiting beliefs and ways of being. So it just becomes very devastating. And then just to close, does that make sense before I move on?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then things to remember, the conditions that develop the shadow aspects of the self is usually things that the conscious mind has to repress because it's incompatible with the way we've been socialized by our families, by our social norms. It's the things that we have to repress consciously. Like, I can't do that. Oh my God, that would be so shameful and embarrassing if I do that. But it's not like because we said that, that inner sense goes away. We just kind of bury it on the inside, and it's waiting to stick its ugly head out at some point. And it has to do with our unresolved conflicts. Like it's so important in any kind of relational dynamic, whether if it's with family, with our significant other, children, friends, when there are conflicts and there are negative feelings, to talk about them and not to shove them in the background, like didn't matter. It always matters because it always will get triggered in another place. And in terms of why the shadow develops, it has a reason because it's protecting our ego in a sense of that sense of self that we have that has to negotiate with the external world. Is trying to keep that ego so that this internal content of the self can have a connective point to the external world. It's trying to, the ego is the mediator between the soul and the inner self to the external world, and is our protective mechanism, and then there's an internal mechanism to protect the ego so that we're not stuck inside of ourselves. We can communicate, negotiate, and work with the world. So the shadow actually comes to protect the ego by keeping like the unwanted traits and impulses away so that we can connect with the outside world. And it's also a way to keep our psychic balance. Sometimes we experience things that are so harsh and the mind can't deal with it at that moment. So the mind will, as a protective mechanism, push things down for now. It's like, I'm going to put that on a shelf. When its timing comes, it's going to come out. But right now, it's too much. So the shadow develops for that reason too. And then there's the unintegrated potential. Like, for example, we have to repress what we're capable of doing because the moment does not allow it. Again, the mind will shelf it. It doesn't get rid of that potential. So it's like unexplored territories of ourselves that life hasn't given us the opportunity, but it's there. So life shelves it for now. And all of it can, like the shadow part of ourself can be catalyst for great understanding. Like when we're in a relationship and we're constantly accusing of someone else doing something bad to us, you're manipulating me. You're neglecting me. We should actually pay attention to that because usually that's the shadow. Like the things that we expect of other people to do, very likely that it is our own shadow that we're projecting on other people, our expectation of other people, where they're lacking, where their gap is, what they're not doing for us, how they're not satisfying us. If pay attention, we are unable to do those things for ourselves, and we really want to, but we're finding someone externally to do those things for us. These are the things to pay attention to, because that projection of it on others without understanding it will ruin so many different facets of our lives because people can only withstand it so much. And we don't really understand our shadow sides until we start interacting with other people. When we sit by ourselves at home alone and we're just watching TV or following our own solo routine, we are perfect beings in our own minds. We don't have a problem. It's only when we come into relation with other people that those aspects of ourselves get revealed. So even when we are in problematic relationships, there are opportunities for growth because they're showing us where our lacks, gaps, shadows, all of these things are in there, and they're having an opportunity to come out for us to become a greater expression of ourselves, to be more integrated, to be more whole, to take claim of our own inherent power. This is the shadow becomes a teacher in this life because it's showing us how we're able to master ourselves, better ourselves. So I don't think we should shy away from it and be shameful of it or feel guilty because it's very useful, and it's a great way to create empathy for other people too and understand other people's perspective in a lot of ways. Because when we acknowledge our own flaws, then we can understand why other people have certain struggles and what is their flaws. So all of these things reduces inner and outer conflict ultimately. All right, so we're going to wrap up this video at this point. Much love. Till next time.